Okay, Adam, you all right for me to go ahead?
Yep, do you want to lead off, Emily? Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, so next up we have Peter Sloman, who is talking on the theme of British Liberals and the politics of place from 1970 to 2020. Peter is a senior lecturer in British politics at Cambridge and a fellow and dean at Electoral College. Before arriving in Cambridge in 2015, he spent 10 years at Oxford, first as a student at Queen's and then as a junior research fellow at New College. Peter's research focuses on electoral politics, political ideas and public policy in modern Britain. His first book, The Liberal Party and the Economy, explored how British Liberals engaged with economic thought in the era of John Maynard Keynes and William Beveridge. His second book, Transfer State, examines how the idea of a guaranteed minimum income has shaped British social policy over the last century. Peter has also contributed articles to Political Studies, the Journal of Social Policy, Historical Research and 20th Century British History. So over to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks very much, Emily, for the kind introduction, and thanks for organising this conference. It's great to be talking about this topic, which I think is considered far too little by both historians of 20th century Britain and by political scientists as well. As Emily said, one of the things I've worked on over the last few years has been liberal politics in Britain, something I've come back to over the last few months. And when the call for papers came out, I thought, what might I be able to talk about? Well, it occurred to me that September 2020 was the 50th anniversary of the famous Eastbourne resolution. At the Liberal Assembly at Eastbourne, after a fairly disastrous general election for the Liberal Party, the party passed a resolution brought by Tony Greaves, an activist in Colne in East Lancashire, committing the party to, I'll put the text up here, a dual approach to politics, acting both inside and outside the political establishment or the institutions of the political establishment, with a primary strategic emphasis on community politics, aiming to help organise people in communities to take and use power, and to build a liberal power base in the major cities of the country. And I'll say a bit more about this in a minute. But in a sense, the Lib Dems are still wrestling with some of the issues raised in the debates over community politics in the early 1970s. This, I think, is something worth reflecting on now, because, of course, there has been enormous interest, as we've already said today, over the last few years in the politics of place. And there is a powerful and influential narrative, of which David Goodhart is perhaps the most striking exponent of the notion that politics has become bifurcated between somewheres who are socially conservative, rooted in provincial towns particularly, and rural areas, and kind of cosmopolitan liberal elites who are citizens of nowhere and have no meaningful connection with local communities. But of course, if you look at the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats in Britain over the last 50 or 60 years, you see that British Liberals have been intimately rooted in localism and local politics. In a sense, Liberal and Lib Dem campaigners have been the original somewheres, and the liberal revival of the post-war period has been profoundly rooted in, I think, a localist reaction against the homogenizing and centralizing tendencies of the British state in the post-war period, and particularly up to the time when the Lib Dems went into coalition in 2010, and that all began to kind of fall apart. So what I want to do in the next 15-20 minutes is reflect on where that liberal localism came from, what it meant, and why it seems to have fallen into such sharp decline over the last 10 years or so. Of course, if you go back to, so here are some examples of classic liberal localism, a focus leaflet from McGoll in the early 1970s, Danny Chambers in North Cornwall at the last general election, with a poster that you can see in the bottom left-hand corner saying "Fund Cornish Schools Fairly," attempting to ring fence a local appeal against the nationalising tendencies of the Brexit tide that we saw in the 2019 election, ultimately unsuccessfully. Now, of course, if you go back to the 19th century, British Liberals had always been the party of the Celtic fringe. John Parry has argued that one of the foundations of Liberal political success in the 19th century was the fact that the party took a more inclusive vision, or had a more inclusive vision of the political nation, that it was more willing to accommodate the regional differences and the local particularities, expressed particularly, most obviously, by Irish Catholics and the Irish demand for home rule, but also the demands of Welsh temperance campaigners for a local option over alcohol licensing, the distinctive languages of North Wales and the Scottish Highlands, and so on and so forth. And of course, Liberals were also at the forefront of municipal activism, in a sense, municipal socialism in the late 19th century, with Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham a prime example. And it's not difficult to come up with a set of arguments for localism within the liberal, sort of classic liberal intellectual tradition. Arguing for the devolution and decentralization of power in a classic Victorian vein as a way of reflecting and respecting local differences, dispersing power and promoting a kind of culture of active citizenship, that people could be active citizens on a local scale in a way that for most people was impossible in terms of Westminster parliamentary politics. But I think we have to be quite careful not to draw a straight line between Victorian liberal political thought and the kind of localist liberal revival of the late 20th century. Because if you look at municipal politics before the First World War, the Liberal Party arguably weakened quicker at local level than it did in Westminster politics. Some of the issues which the Liberal Party was able to mobilise people around in the era of Asquith and Lloyd George, issues like Irish Home Rule, free trade, and national taxation, and the growth of the welfare state, played out much more naturally and effectively for the party at national level, whereas municipal politics tended to polarize around debates over the level of local taxation, which played out between the Labour Party and sort of centre-left liberals and ratepayers groups and kind of anti-state, low rate, low tax kind of groups. And if one of the big sort of macro stories of the 20th century British state is a shift from local provision of public services to the kind of nationalisation of the welfare state, then the Liberal governments of 1905 to 15 played a pretty big role in setting that process in motion, for instance, by creating national insurance and taking elements of social security and social welfare provision away from local authorities and investing them in national institutions. Even when the Liberal Party went into decline in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, it basically became quite localist by accident, insofar as the places that continued to return Liberal MPs tended to be those which were most insulated from national political trends and felt most remote from London and central government. And so people like Joe Grimmond up in Orkney and Shetland were able to make localist appeals on the basis of constituency service and kind of standing up for the periphery against homogenizing tendencies. But these were often areas where local politics was pretty non-partisan, and local elections weren't really fought on party political lines. And it's interesting that if you look at the Liberal Party's leaders in the post-war period, Clement Davis in Montgomeryshire, then Grimmond, then Jeremy Thorpe in North Devon, and then David Steele in the Borders. These were MPs who engaged in constituency service, who saw themselves as kind of community politicians in a constituency sense, but who actually had quite limited engagement with local government, and where the local Liberal organisation often was organised around their kind of personality politics, rather than around kind of pavement activism in a kind of year-round kind of way. So I think we need to see the liberal localism of the late 20th century as a distinctive phenomenon, which emerged from the particular social and intellectual landscape of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, there is a case for saying, and Mark Egan, a historian who now works, I think, in the kind of House of Commons parliamentary research service, has argued that in a sense, the motion which Tony Greaves moved in 1970, calling for the Liberal Party to adopt community politics as its strategy, was really an attempt to theorize something which the party was already doing in quite a lot of areas. From the mid-1950s onwards, you can see local activists in places like Rugby and Eastbourne, and increasingly in inner city areas in Birmingham and Liverpool, using kind of pavement politics campaigning, heavy concentration on sort of really local issues, housing, potholes, and service provision as a basis for re-establishing a presence, and kind of giving voice to a liberal message, which they hoped would be the springboard for parliamentary campaigning. And the classic example of this, in a sense, the kind of poster boy for how this could be used to build up local support and then win a parliamentary seat, was Wallace Lawler in Birmingham in the late 1960s. You can see on the right there a leaflet which Lawler and his team distributed in the 1969 Birmingham Edgbaston by-election, Birmingham Ladywood by-election, I think, where Lawler was a local MP, local councillor. He'd fought his seat 6 times before being elected in 1962. He'd built up a small local machine in some of the most deprived districts of Birmingham, particularly trying to appeal to people who were disaffected by housing redevelopment, and by the sense that housing redevelopment was slow, that lots of slum houses had been bought up, but then not demolished, or when they were demolished, the kind of housing estates that emerge were seen to be soulless and kind of impersonal. And he positioned himself in his literature explicitly as a kind of ombudsman for the entire city, someone who would be on the phone several hours a day, complaining to Birmingham Corporation about the inadequacy of its service provision. Lawler's case provides, in a sense, a kind of cautionary tale for how liberal localism could devolve into a sort of fairly problematic local populism, because, of course, immigration was a big issue in Birmingham in the late 1960s. This was the era of the Rivers of Blood speech and Enoch Powell stoking racial tensions. And Lawler and the Birmingham Liberals kind of at least gestured in the direction of that kind of racial politics, calling for a kind of moratorium on the arrival of new immigrants to Birmingham until more support was provided by central government to prevent overcrowding, to deal with overcrowded school class sizes, to make sure that everyone who moved to Birmingham was able to speak English, and that school classrooms were not disrupted by kids turning up who couldn't speak English and so on. So things which we would nowadays regard as fairly nativist kind of dog whistles, and the National Liberal Party found it quite difficult to navigate the tension between taking advantage of Lawler's popularity and his success. He won the by-election in 1969, whilst distancing itself from some of those anti-immigrant sentiments, because at national level, the party positioned itself firmly to the left of Labour in opposing immigration restrictions. Indeed, Jeremy Thorpe spent most of the 1970 campaign basically baiting Enoch Powell and calling him a racist. Now, it's interesting then that what you see in the early 70s is an attempt to kind of square this circle. That some of the young liberals who had been involved in anti-Vietnam War and anti-apartheid, and indeed pro-immigration campaigning, basically took up community politics and turned to local government, and tried to kind of use some of the ideas coming out of the New Left around community action and community representation as a way of giving a sort of centre-left liberal spin to this kind of local campaigning, kind of marginalising the Lawlers of the party, whilst bringing on board and kind of building alliances with other local activists like Cyril Carr and Trevor Jones in Liverpool, who were keen to shift the focus of the party's kind of energies away from national parliamentary politics towards the grassroots. I think in the early 70s, partly because of the local government reorganisation, but also because this was the peak of kind of top-down technocratic politics on the part of the Heath and Wilson governments, the Liberals were able to tap into a mood of disaffection. Michael Steed, political scientist at Manchester University, who fought the Manchester Exchange by-election in 1973 and came a pretty strong second in a city Labour seat, felt that the key to the mood of the electorate was what he called the feeling of utter powerlessness, the sense that people wanted a voice, and the Liberals were able to position themselves as activists who would give them a voice. It's really interesting that in the early 1970s, if you read through the minutes of National Executive Committee meetings of the Liberal Party, all of a sudden you see people using the title councillor. And it became fashionable within the party that almost the mark of credibility, political credibility within the party, particularly in England, was the ability to fight and win council seats. And that became a kind of political currency which shaped the party's internal culture and its approach to campaigning. From 1977, the Association of Liberal Councillors was based in Hebden Bridge, in the Birchcliffe Centre, a converted Baptist chapel, and promoted very energetically community politics, both as a strategy and almost as a kind of way of life for the most dedicated liberal activists. And it's quite interesting that many of the people involved in pushing forward the kind of ALC approach to campaigning were pretty left-wing in their or pretty new left, I guess, in their vision of what community politics would look like and their ability to change the dynamics of British society and give people a voice and kind of challenge what they saw as the political establishment. Now, there is an argument for saying that the way this played out in many areas was much more conventional, and that community politics increasingly became a form of electoral technique rather than the kind of radical challenge to traditional forms of representation which some of its enthusiasts had intended. And you see this playing out in internal party debates through the 80s and 90s, a tension, I guess, between kind of liberator and radical bulletin and some of the sort of activist groups who wanted the party to retain a really distinctive political edge to its local campaigning. And the kind of party's campaigns department and more pragmatic electoralist liberals who were mainly focused on thinking about how can we win seats and use that as a springboard for political success. It's interesting that if you think about the kind of typical Liberal or Lib Dem councillor or MP in the 1980s, 90s and 2000s, they are normally fairly middle class men and women, either people with local roots or people who have moved to the area and decided to get involved in campaigning, often geared, particularly in the wake of the Thatcher cuts in the 1980s, geared towards the defence of local public services and schools, hospitals, libraries, and so on, sometimes with a fairly hefty dose of NIMBYism. And this was encouraged centrally by the campaigns department, particularly, I think, by Chris Renard in the 1990s. If you look at his memoir, which I think, so the first volume of Renard's memoirs, pretty good, run up to 2007, say nothing about the scandals that have consumed him since then in relation to allegations of sexual harassment and so on. But I think his memoir gives a really useful insight into how the party's strategists thought about electoral politics in the period of growth under Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy. Renard says that the Lib Dems won by localizing the message, focusing attention on the local candidate and the local councillor, showing that they were credible, that they kept their word. And what this meant in policy terms, particularly, was focusing on health, education, and crime, issues where the party could claim to be in tune with kind of every man and every woman at a local level. And national policies geared towards investment in public services provided a way of kind of backing up that local message. I think the party's commitment to constitutional reform was also more important than many realised, even though most voters aren't that interested in constitutional issues. The fact that the Lib Dems were constantly talking about PR, localism, changing the system, gave their campaigning a kind of anti-establishment edge that was completely lost when the party went into coalition in 2010 and changed much of its political register and rhetoric. So I think the party's difficulties over the last decade are partly a function of the coalition. But I think we also need to ask some bigger questions about what community politics looks like in an increasingly polarized political environment. One of the really interesting things about the pre-2010 Lib Dem coalition, as I've argued in a recent piece in Political Quarterly, is that it kind of straddled both the most cosmopolitan seats, such as Cambridge, and some of the most provincial and peripheral seats, such as Burnley, where Brexit has really become a major political issue, and the kind of soft populism of local Lib Dem campaigning has been completely outflanked by the harder populism of the Tory right and UKIP over the last 10 years. But I think it's also interesting. So there is a really interesting debate going on within the Lib Dem party right now over how it can rebuild in the wake of the 2019 election results. And there's a really interesting Twitter thread by Alicia Lewis, which I saw earlier in the summer, who I don't know in person, some of you may know, in which she's arguing that the kind of culture war of the last few years has made it much harder for the Lib Dems to do community politics, because communities now look very different. And she is concerned about a tendency within the party to kind of revert to a kind of lowest common denominator community campaigning, which marginalizes issues of racial justice, gender, sexuality, and so on. Now, I can see what she's getting at here. And there are clearly interesting affinities between, you know, her Twitter thread clearly resonates with many younger activists within the party. But there's also quite a difficult question for the Lib Dems, that if they want to rebuild in parts of the country which are more culturally conservative, provincial, suburban, rural, then in a first past the post system, they are probably going to need to appeal to at least 40% of a local electorate. And there is a real challenge that I think the party now faces between providing a distinctive national message, which is distinctively liberal, and rebuilding its local political base in areas where Brexit is quite popular, and Joe Swinson's campaign went down like a lead balloon. My sense is that Ed Davey is kind of trying to take the party back to basics, trying to develop a national message which is not going to put off some of the people who were willing to vote for the party in the 1980s and 1990s on the basis of a pavement politics appeal, but stand on the other side of the kind of cultural cleavage which has opened up between cosmopolitans and provincial voters over the last few years. Whether the party is going to allow him to do that, or whether that is going to give him enough distinctiveness to keep the party alive in the kind of national media environment over the next couple of years, is to me a very much an open question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Peter, for that. That was a brilliant presentation. Actually, I think a lot of what you said in the latter part of that is relevant to the roundtable discussion that Martin and Anthony will be talking about later on at the end of the conference. So that would be really useful. Are there any questions then for Peter? I know there weren't any chat messages, so if we just go to anyone who has a particular question to begin with.
I think Matthew has a question.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Okay. My question was just to ask you what future you think there is in liberal localism, given not only what you mentioned about the difficulty of straddling the somewhere anywhere divide, but also the problems that the Lib Dems have had holding together any coalition at all. You know, particularly I'm thinking of the seats that survived the 2015 wipeout. I think they still only hold 2 of them, Alistair Carmichael in Orkney and Tim Farron in Westmoreland. So there's clearly a sort of a very febrile liberal coalition at the moment, which seems to sort of cut against the sort of localist impetus. So I was just wondering whether you think there's any road back to the Lib Dems being able to hold together a more stable coalition.
Thanks. That's a great question. It's interesting that if you set aside Scotland, the Lib Dems have 8 MPs in England and Wales, which is the same as they had 7 MPs in England and Wales, which is the same as they had in 2015. But whereas in 2015 they were pretty isolated cases, you know, Tim Farron, Norman Lamb, Tom Brake, and so on, often elected on the basis of a kind of personal vote, or the fact that they had seemed to be so well entrenched that the Tories didn't throw that many resources at them in in 2015. The 7 MPs in England that the party has now are in a much more kind of sociologically contiguous area, right? That they're all fairly affluent, with the exception of Tim Farron, that they're fairly affluent southern university seats or suburban seats, Bath, Oxford West, St Albans and Twickenham and so on, which are very much at the kind of cosmopolitan end of that divide. And most of the seats which the party can conceivably hope to win at the next election are also, South Cambridgeshire, for instance, are also at that end of the spectrum. So it is possible to see how a fairly distinctively sort of centre-left, socially progressive, socially liberal party, unapologetically pro-European, might win 20 or 25 seats at the next election. But I think there are elements within the party, including Ed Davey, who are actually quite uncomfortable with the notion of retreating to being a party of the kind of suburban middle classes. And in a sense, what I think the gamble is at the moment is to hope that by downplaying Brexit and pro-Europeanism, stepping back from some of those kind of cultural hot button issues, the party can rebuild its position in the southwest and in parts of rural Wales and perhaps parts of northern England. But because it's still in quite a good place electorally in the southeast, that it can nevertheless make those gains in South Cambridgeshire and Guildford and so on at the next election as the kind of tactical alternative to the Conservatives. So I can kind of see what Davey's trying to do. But the risk is, of course, that if the party remains at 4 or 5% in the polls, then it just gets completely marginalised, overtaken by the Greens. Nobody quite knows what it stands for, and Keir Starmer and Labour are able to kind of leapfrog the Lib Dems in some of their target seats, because nobody quite sees what the point of a Lib Dem representation would be. I think that's a real challenge for the party, and so though I can see what Davey is trying to do, it's going to be a real balancing act, almost between national visibility and kind of reassuring or almost reconnecting with what you might see as the median or floating voter in some of its former peripheral seats.
Okay, great. I think, Adam, do we have time for one more question, or do you want me to move on?
Yeah, let's take another question.
So there's one more in the chat now from Joseph.
I'll read the question to myself then. Do I think that under Ed Davey, the Lib Dems are heading back to their classical liberal ideological roots? No, I don't, actually. I mean, Ed Davey is an economist, and economists, train PPE, Oxford PPEs tend to think in a certain way, tend to be reasonably open to kind of market-based solutions and reasonably concerned about the deficit and so on. But I think there is a wide recognition within the party that the coalition was really damaging, that there aren't very many votes to be won in a kind of orange book, sort of centre-right, socially liberal kind of appeal. And I think, I mean, Ed Davey learnt his political skills as an advisor to Paddy Ashdown. I think the party is trying to go back to its early 1990s kind of model of pavement politics combined with a commitment to investment in public services and kind of rebuilding that coalition between rural and suburban voters as the kind of anti-conservative party in parts of the country where Labour can't win. I think that is what Davey's strategy is going to look like. Classical liberalism, I mean, yeah, there will always be a place for classical liberals in the party, but I'd be very surprised if there was a return to the kind of centre-right positioning that the party sometimes had under Nick Clegg.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Peter. I think to keep on track with timing, I will now hand over to Adam, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Emily.